First, living in the Banyule Council of Melbourne, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people as the original custodians of the land, and pay respect to all elders, past and present, who have resided in the area and have been integral to the part of this region's beautiful history. Now, I don't know whether anyone notices the slight intertextuality with the word peripatetic, because the first time I came across the term being associated with printers was when I was conducting research regarding John Degatati, who's a New South Wales printer and printed the Art of Printing in 1861. So it's a really, really important figure. And I just, that word just stayed with me from the very beginning. Also, I need to have a disclaimer. This is, as I've just had published Printer in the Middle, the Copyright Act 1879, the New South Wales Government Printing Office, and Legal Deposit in 19th century Australia in the media history. I am now going into this new area of research which has been impeded by COVID. So I've managed to cobble together something based using Trove and other resources, online resources at my disposal. But I do acknowledge there is a wealth of experience and knowledge in the audience in terms of Wallace Kirsop, Sally Bloomfield, Paul Eggert, and others who I'm sure knows all the information that I've synthesized today. So I just wanted to acknowledge you guys as well. Okay, so I had to narrow my scope for this because it was originally 20 minutes, but we've got less. So I am just looking today at, I am only looking today at George Terry Howe and Andrew Bent. But I thought there were some lovely pictures that I'd sourced. One is on the left-hand side of a stained glass window, the publication of the first Australian newspaper, 1803, that's in the Mitchell Library. And I acknowledging the photo of David Fisher obtained from the Australian Media Hall of Fame. And certainly we've got John Pascoe Fawkner in the middle with the imprint of Andrew Bent, printer, care of Sally Bloomfield and Crane Collins from their amazing website, and details are listed there. But certainly the focus of today is the movement of printers and their technologies and practices across Bass Strait. And it was in clear evidence in the 1820s. As my abstract indicates, New South Wales Government printer George Howe's son, George Terry, from his second marriage, began a press in northern Tasmania in 1825 to print the Tasmanian Port Dalrymple Advertiser. Going on to Bent, Andrew Bent, who commenced his professional life in 1812 under the employ of Tasmanian's first government printer, George Clark, and whom he succeeded in 1815 until 1825, left Tasmania in 1839. Does say, my abstract does say to seek new opportunities in Sydney, but basically he left under a tremendous cloud, which was unfortunate. Within 2 months, Bent had established the newspaper Bent's News and New South Wales Advertiser. So this paper today explores the colonial connections and collaborations between George Terry and Bent with reference to his George Terry's half-brother, Robert Howe, to not just critically map the production or start to critically map the production, networking distribution of content across the Strait in 19th century, but to start building a picture about how these connections and collaborations contributed to the formation of a national print culture, which is my overriding postdoctoral focus. Now, moving on to, and so we have all these beautiful examples of newspapers that we can obtain from Trove. So George Terry contributed to Tasmanian print culture through his newspaper proprietorship and printing. As reported in the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser on this Thursday, the 2nd of December, 1824, which you can see here, on Saturday, the 27th of November, the previous week, the Cutter Eclipse sailed for Port Dalrymple. Oh, sailed for Port Dalrymple, transporting cargo for an unnamed printing office to be established in Launceston. The unknown proprietor of the printing office intended to print Launceston's first newspaper, the Tasmanian Port Dalrymple Advertiser, in the new year. The Sydney Gazette was at that time under the editorship of George Howe's son, Robert, George Terry's half-brother. The shipping intelligence of the Gazette in the same issue reported that the passengers on the Eclipse included, quote, Mr. and Mrs. George Howe. So that was George Terry and his wife Sarah. An earlier notice published in 18th of November 1824 in the Gazette stated that, quote, printing materials till returns come from Europe will be scanty, and the columns of the little journal will only assume a humble appearance. I really appreciate sort of the use of the word novel that you can see here in the first line that I've underlined to describe the printing cargo, but I'm intrigued, given the potential conflict of interest, by the statement, quote, which I've underlined as well, we hope he may, proper encouragement will go a great way, unquote. The word proper encouragement could be interpreted in diverse ways, which I will seek to explore further in terms of, readership, subscriptions, familial connections, and support. So the first issue of the Tasmanian was printed not long after New Year, as I said, on the 5th of January, 1825. Subscribers who wished to, quote, patronise and support the undertaking, unquote, were encouraged to contact persons affiliated with the paper. These were merchant and commission agent James Ryby, former Robert Howe agent Richard White, and merchant Andrew Burrell, all of whom advertised regularly in the Tasmanian. They could also contact George Terry himself as the proprietor and publisher, or Andrew Bent, the government printer. Its size was equal to the Hobart Town Gazette, which was established and printed, as we know, by Bent, and its price, if paid in advance, was £2 per shillings per annum. Towards the end of the advertisement within the first issue, George Terry explained that the large type was brought, quote, purposely to the settlement, unquote, thus confirming that he furnished his printing house with resources transported on the Eclipse from New South Wales. Explicit connections with Robert Howe, specifically in New South Wales generally, were evident from the outset, therefore, in this first issue. Robert Howe published, and it's the text is surrounded there in a box, published in an advertisement dated 24th of November 1824, reporting that he had, quote, empowered Mr. George T. Howe, publisher and proprietor of the Tasmania at Launceston, to be his agent in the part of Van Diemen's Land called Port Dalrymple and all of its surrounding neighbourhood, unquote. It is interesting that the reception that the Tasmanian received from its nearest competitor, which of course is Bent's Hobart Town Gazette. Ostensibly, Bent declared that he was, quote, extremely proud, unquote, to welcome the competition because of the diversity that its establishment provided the Tasmanian community, stating that, quote, we considered that a community like this was entitled to a choice for either the judicious bestowal of the patronage or the free dissemination of its sentiments, unquote, as well as of the interrelated importance of avoiding media totalitarianism, where he says, we were convinced that however impartial our conduct might be in respect of inserting or including correspondence, the disappointed would naturally think they were martyrs to our controlled and capricious domination, unquote. However, plainly avowing media diversity and democratic free speech, stating, quote, to wield the press is to have power, which can and often be abused. Readers are left to wonder how sincere Bent is with comments like, quote, we shall now be as happy to profit from his wisdom. This is unquote. This assumed sincerity hinted at here becomes more concrete in hindsight, as we shall see next.
10 minutes in, 5 minutes to go.
Oh, okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, so George Terry published 20 issues of the Tasmanian, with the final one printed in on 18th of May 1825. The extract on the left could give the impression to 21st century readers that the newspaper discontinued on account of financial difficulties, especially with 19th century readers were informed that, quote, Mr. Richard White, having been appointed to agent to the undersigned at this place, is herewith fully empowered and authorised to receive and grant acquittances for all the outstanding debts belonging to the establishment, unquote. Furthermore, George Terry reported that he intended to establish a new journal shortly in Hobart. And on the second page of this issue that we can see, his departure from Launceston was, quote, hasty and unexpected, albeit he appears to contradict himself potentially by stating that the publication of the Tasmanian would be suspended, quote, at this place for some time, unquote. This possible interpretation is confirmed by Howe when he vaguely stated that same month in the Sydney Gazette that, quote, it is thought that it would be necessary for the Tasmanian to suspend operations for some months at least, unquote. According to Herbert Easton, though, George Terry was offered Andrew Bent's job as government printer by Lieutenant General George Arthur, and he was promised a subsidy of £30 a year. Heaton wrote that, quote, that George Terry was attracted by these terms, and he came to Hobart with his press and his type. So he moved his press and type from Launceston to Hobart. And after arranging a partnership with James Ross, he produced his first copy of the Hobart Town Gazette on the 25th of June, 1825. Heaton observed that George Terry had pirated the name of Hobart Town Gazette from Bent. And when Bent complained about this, he was informed that he was no longer government printer. His newspaper had lost its official recognition. He was therefore compelled to accept the circumstances and renamed his paper the Colonial Times in August. So we know that identified, you may or may not know, I didn't know the connection with Robert Murray until recently, that Howe was identified by Robert Murray as the Howe of Tasmania. And that was in the Austral-Asiatic Review in 1828. Bent's outputs as government printer were significant. They included newspapers, as we know, such as the Hobart Town Gazette and Southern Reporter. His first issue was on the 11th of May, 1816, but it was renamed the Hobart Town Gazette and Van Diemen's Land Advertiser in 1821. You've got Thomas E. Wells's book, Michael Howe, The Last and Worst of the Bushrangers of Van Diemen's Land, and the Van Diemen's Land Pocket Almanac. Similarly to George Howe with his Sydney Gazette in the first decades of the 1800s, as I've reported last year, Bent's work suffered from material and technological constraints. Bent's press was small size, the paper was usually of poor quality and short supply, as well as expensive, costing £2 per ream in 1816. And you can see his feelings about it on the right there. Bent was known to manufacture his own ink, as his typographical brother, Robert Howe, reported in the Sydney Gazette in 1821, and there was often insufficient amount of type to compose an issue altogether, and it is well recorded that he often had to resort to using a capital A for the lowercase a in his texts. This was expressed as we can see here, in the Hobart Town Gazette on the 7th of January, 1825. Bent was proactive, though, in alleviating his technological frustration. He announced in 1821 he had extended his business by starting copy plate printing, which he, quote, trusts will be executed in such a manner as to give general satisfaction, unquote. Nevertheless, we see shared stories and connections manifest in all these hardships and constraints across the strait. Now, I've provided a little, because at the culmination of all this, Joan Woodbury in 1965 credited the Hobart Town Gazette and Southern Reporter's importance to the emancipation of the press in Tasmania. Ironically, starting as a government gazette, its establishment in 1816 is when, quote, the press began to take its place as a vehicle of public and private opinion, as a lively opposition to autocracy. When George Arthur was appointed Lieutenant Governor in 1824, he endeavoured to control the press in Tasmania, and Woodbury observed that Bent was, quote, always proud of his stand against Arthur, who he regarded as the enemy of free institutions. However, the enmity was equally reciprocated, as Arthur despised Bent for his station as a pardoned convict and firmly rejected such persons holding any responsible office. So the ensuing years would amount to a public brawl between the two and culminate in Bent's destitution and that of his family. And so I've given a little timeline about how quickly this had occurred. In terms of 1824, he printed the Hobart Town Gazette without approval from the government-appointed censor, Henry Eminent. He lost the contract to Howe and Ross, whose paper apparently, quote, sang the praises of Arthur's administration. He lost his license. He secured a license with Governor Brisbane in Sydney, further infuriating Arthur, continued printing and launching the Colonial Times. And of course, there was the presumed very problematic writings by Robert Murray under the name of A Colonist, which criticised the government. And the first time he was charged with libel and imprisoned was in August 1825. According to J.E. Calder in the Mercury that month, he stated, this was the first of several crushing blows that Colonel Arthur dealt his unflinching adversary, which eventually landed him and his family in ruin. And just finishing up, just other examples of how quickly Andrew Bent lost his livelihood and his profession in between 1827 and then culminating in February 1839, where Bent and his family departed for Hobart for Sydney. He established the weekly paper Bent's News and New South Wales Advertiser, though ceased operations after 9 months, and whereupon he was destitute. Now, the thing about this is that he did maintain connections with printing in New South Wales, even when destitute. He printed an appeal to the sympathies and benevolence of the Australian public for relief for Mr. Andrew Bent and his large family who suffer a state of utter destitution. And in a letter to the New South Wales Governor on the 11th of March 1844, he said, "If my appeal to be read, I am led to believe I shall not be considered to have been an useless member of society generally in these colonies, but that I've always kept in view the furtherance of literature." Now, just wrapping up, I'm sorry, coming to the end, it's my first online thing. Thinking about final conclusions about these connections between George Terry Howe and Robert Bent, we can see a comparatively quiet end for George Terry, who was considered quite precocious. He was in the text here from A.G. Foster in 1924, he was the fact that he was a youth of 18 years of age when he moved. Surely the youngest government printer Australia's ever produced when he was government printer in Tasmania. But at the bottom, when you can see the obituary in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 8th of April, 1863, his legacy is only so far as he was the son of George Howe, who certainly was a proprietor and editor of the first newspaper, the Sydney Gazette, Australia's first newspaper. And it's interesting to see on the left here in the Mercury in 1953.
We're not seeing that screen, Jocelyn. You want to just forward it on one more? Yeah.
There we are. So we see on the left here, there's a descendant of George Terry Howe who was requesting information about him. So there isn't a lot of information that out there that we have in comparison to George Bent, which is quite significant. And so here I just wanted to finish off in terms of thinking about Bent's legacy to not only, the freedom of the press, but also the contribution he made to 19th century European culture, is when we're thinking about the literary depiction of Bent by Henry Savary. Now, this was published in the Hobart Town Gazette in 1824, but was cited in Joan Woodbury in her article. So he says there, I recognise no less a personage than the industrious, praiseworthy individual to whom the public are under an everlasting debt of gratitude for laying the foundation of the press in this colony and for his subsequent efforts towards raising it to the present highly respectable footing. And that is it. So, yes.